Capitola, come to the coast with me. The sun and the sky are free. We'll play in the sand and sea. Capitola, paradise you'll adore. I'll take your hand there on the sand along the shore.
We are here at the home of Nancy Lenox, who grew up in the Capitola and Live Oak area in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And she's going to share some of her memories from that period. Nancy, thank you so much for being part of the Capitola Memories Project.
It's a pleasure.
When did your family first come to Capitola?
My grandparents, Lionel Tracy Lenox and Alice Sarah Jackson Lenox, started coming to Capitola in the early 1900s, and actually the Capitola Museum has a number of photographs that my grandfather took during that time. But really the stories that go with those photographs are my family history, not my own stories. So my personal memory of Capitola starts in the 1950s.
Well, I've looked through some of the photographs that you provided the museum quite a few years back, and they're wonderful photos. Was your grandfather a professional photographer?
No, he was not. He was a banker by trade, and he did photography beginning in 1905. He had French cameras, lived in Palo Alto and Mountain View and Campbell, and came to Santa Cruz and Capitola vacationing. And he was a photographer. He would have done it professionally, I'm sure, if he thought he could have supported a family doing it. He did later, when he retired and moved to Santa Cruz, he did professional wedding photography and portrait photography as a supplementary to his pension.
Now, back in 1905, he must have had to develop the pictures and print them himself, right?
He did. He had a darkroom in his home, and when he retired to Santa Cruz, he moved his darkroom. He had a whole section of the downstairs of his house here in Santa Cruz that was a darkroom.
And whereabouts did he live when he finally moved to Santa Cruz?
In the 1920s, he purchased a piece of property on the shore of what's now the yacht harbor, and he built a summer house. And the family came to that summer house during the 20s and 30s. They actually lived in that house in the mid-30s when they sold their house in Los Gatos because of the Depression. And my father graduated from Santa Cruz High School. And then in the 1950s, when they retired, they moved down from San Francisco into that house that's on the shore of what's now the yacht harbor. And my grandfather used to complain that the property taxes on his house were more than what he had paid for the property and the house in the first place.
What are your earliest memories of Live Oak and Capitola?
When I was a child, we would come to Capitola Beach in the summertime, and of course, the rule that we little kids knew was there's this fenced area, and that is the area that you can go in unless you know how to swim. And in fact, the museum has pictures of my dad when he was a kid in that same part of the Capitola Lagoon. And so we would go and splash around in the water, and there was the water was perhaps not as clean now as not as clean then as it is now. I remember there was one time that I was out splashing around in the water and I saw what looked like a floating rock, and as I got closer to it realized that no, actually it was not a rock. But we had a good time, and we also My dad worked for County Bank of Santa Cruz, and for many years they had a float in the Begonia Festival. And so we would help put the floats together. We would go the day and the night before, and the adults got to go in the water and put the begonias on the float. But as kids, our job was to they had a little bent piece of wire that would go through each flower, and so our job was to take the flowers out of the box and put the wire on them and then put them back so that the big people, the tall people, could get in the water up to their waist and put the begonias on the floats themselves.
I heard that the begonia blossoms stain your fingers. Is that true? Do you remember that?
I don't really remember, to tell you the truth. We were having so much fun. I mean, it was a lot of fun as a kid to go and you know, of course, we had our job to do to get the begonias ready to go on the float, but we also had a lot of opportunity to run up and down the pathway and look at all the other floats as they were being put together. But it's entirely possible that my hands were completely stained from the begonias, but I really don't remember.
Now, this was the day before or the night before?
Yeah. The begonias couldn't be put on too far ahead of time because they would wilt. And so the floats, of course they could make the floats well ahead of time, build them out of wood, and then put chicken wire on them. But the flowers couldn't be put on until the day before the begonia parade. And so it was often well into the night and sometimes even early in the morning before the last flowers were put on.
Do you remember what sort of floats the county bank had?
I actually have one of my favorite photographs of my dad is County Bank had, they usually said County Bank since 1870. I remember there was one year that it was a big egg, and it was something about, you know, County Bank where you can put your nest egg. And there was one year that the float, there was a big red flowered backdrop that said County Bank since 1870, and then there was a place in front of that backdrop where some lovely young woman in a bathing suit was going to be sitting for the water parade, and my dad sat in that spot to test it out and make sure that it was okay. And so I have this great photograph of him grinning, big grin on his face, sitting, being the mock queen.
The 1960s must have been an interesting time in Capitola. Tell us a little bit about growing up during that period and where you went to school.
I went to Soquel High School. We were actually the first class that started at Soquel as freshmen and went all the way through all 4 years. Before that, I went to Live Oak School, Live Oak Elementary School, and then Branciforte Junior High. As a young teenager, I loved to go to Capitola in the summertime. And the deal that I made with my parents, we were regular attenders. We were members of the Capitola Baptist Church on Capitola Road and 46th Avenue. And if I would agree to teach Vacation Bible School, then I could go down to Capitola afterwards. And so I would go and teach Vacation Bible School with my bathing suit under my church clothes. And as soon as the little Vacation Bible Schoolers were on their way home, then my friend and I would walk down from 46th Avenue down to Capitola Beach. And one of the first people that I met when I started going down there, I was about 15 then, was Jojo Urbancic, who was just the sweetest person, outgoing, friendly, and just sort of introduced himself right away, and not in a, he wasn't trying to pick up girls, he was just friendly. You know, he would have responded to me in the same way if I were a young boy, I'm sure. You know, so that was nice. And through him, I met his brother Frank, who lived on 48th Avenue. And I was in the high school band. And for the first couple of years, the high school band, I was also in the pep band, which meant that when there were football games that were out of town, we would go and my dad would drop me off at Soquel High in my band uniform with my clarinet, and we would get on the bus and we would ride to Salinas or Watsonville or wherever the game was and play for the away football games. In my junior year, I told my parents I was in the pep band, so I would do the same routine. I would put on my band uniform and pick up my clarinet, and my dad would drive me to Soquel High School, and I would wave goodbye to him, and then I would go and put my clarinet and the hat from my band uniform in my locker, go over to the back of the school and down the hill and walk over to 48th Avenue to Frank and JoJo's house and listen to Red Fox on records and have a good old time. Now, when I was there, KSCO would broadcast the away football games. And so we had to listen to at least the latter part of the football game so that we knew, for one thing, when the game was over. So when would it be time for me to head back to Soquel High and be there when my dad came to pick me up, and who won? Because my dad would at least ask that question. I could feign ignorance about the particulars of the game, but I did have to know who won, what was the final score, and I needed to know when to go back to the high school to be picked up.
Now, what day of the week were the games?
They would be Friday and Saturday, you know, usually on the weekend. What else? You know, the other thing about Capitola is that it was a great place. It was kind of like a miniature boardwalk, and I spent hours and hours in the Petersons. Had a place where there was skee ball and pokerino and pinball machines. And I remember there was one of the pinball machines that was my favorite that had a fan. And every time that someone won a game, the fan would click over one more notch. And when it clicked all the way to the end of the fan, whoever won that last game would get a whole bunch of free games to play. And so we spent a lot of time on that machine. And I learned how to play skee ball, sort of, more or less, and pokerino too.
I've been wondering about the pokerino. I've heard of the game. That was more of probably in those days it wasn't an electronic version, but more of a mechanical version.
Oh, it was totally mechanical. Yeah. Yeah, it was sit on a stool, and at about chest height in front of you there was a wooden runway, and then at the end of the runway there were holes that were about this big around that the ball would drop into, and though each of those holes corresponded to a playing card that would light up if you could roll the ball and it dropped into that hole, it would light up the corresponding playing card on a lighted backdrop. And
so the idea was to get the best poker hand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what did you win if you got a really good poker hand? Anything?
Yeah, you won free games, so you could play some more. There was, and also tickets too. You would win
tickets for little prizes.
Yeah, for the skee ball and pokerino, you won tickets, and there were little prizes. little woven finger traps that if you put your fingers in them and pulled, it would pull it tighter and your fingers couldn't get out. Little plastic rings, the little tiny paper cocktail umbrellas. I was never patient enough to hold on to the tickets long enough to get the bigger prizes, but all sorts of just little silly things, pencils. And fans that would little paper fans.
I remember those.
Yeah, that would open up into a little woven paper circle.
I think I got mine at the dentist's office after that. Not as much fun that way.
My dentist actually gave us lollipops.
Interesting.
Which in retrospect, it's like, he was like creating future business.
Well, at least he didn't give you peanut brittle or something.
No.
Tell us a little bit about the man who was the lifeguard.
There was a lifeguard. I honestly, I don't remember his name. I don't know. I think he was trying to learn how to surf, but he had this lifeguard job. He was supposed to be paying attention to people in the lagoon. And so he would put a surfboard in the lagoon on the adult side and get on top and get on it and balance on it and use an umbrella. He would open just a regular rain umbrella and catch the wind, and that would float him gracefully around the lagoon, and I guess, kept him amused while there was nobody in distress in the water, so it gave him something to do as a lifeguard.
For inventor of windsurfing.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Tell us about Joe Hill's flat feet.
Joe Hill was one of the many young men who hung around Capitola along the wall to the seawall, and he was very athletic, and he would stand on the seawall and do backflips and land on his feet on the sand. And he later was actually kind of happy that he had done that, because it turned out when he was drafted to serve in Vietnam, they labeled him 4F, so they would not take him into the service because he had flat feet. And he was convinced that the reason he had flat feet was because he had done so many backflips onto the Capitola beach, and the pounding of his feet on the sand had just kind of flattened them out. I don't know if that is the actual reason he had flat feet, but he was convinced.
Tell us about some of the food that they served along the Esplanade.
On the far end of the Esplanade, towards the Depot Hill Cliffs, there was a restaurant called the Bandstand, and they had hamburgers, soft drinks, and the best French fries ever. And so that was always part of our routine of being at the beach, was we had to go to the Bandstand and get something to eat. And you could go between the Bandstand and the Peterson's restaurant, which was just to the right of it as you faced it. There was a little shaded walkway between the two buildings where you could get down to the beach. And then there was also a walkway in back of both of the buildings where you could walk along between the buildings and down to the beach.
Were people still using a lot of beach umbrellas back then? I've seen some early pictures where they're just umbrellas all over the beach, but that might have been earlier.
Not so much, no.
Were there any activities on the beach other than sunbathing, like volleyball or?
Not that I remember, no. Not during those years.
And no boogie boards yet, or did they have those?
No, I don't remember boogie boards. There was on the lagoon, there was a guy who had a concession to rent paddle boats and canoes, but I never did that, just because it cost money, and we could hang out on the beach for nothing.
What about the wharf? Did you or your friends ever do anything on the wharf, go fishing or
Not really.
like that?
No.
No.
No. That wasn't where the boys were.
Okay. Or at least not the boys you were interested in, right?
Yeah. They were all kind of hanging around on the seawall and by the merry-go-round and by the bandstand and at the bowling alley.
Now, a term has come up that I heard recently, and I wanted to see if you had ever heard of it, and that's the term Tola Rat.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, now what's a Tola Rat?
Well, the Tola Rats are the guys, mostly the guys, who hung out along the seawall and, like Joe Hill, did acrobatics to impress the ladies and surfed. There was some surfing that happened to Capitola. It wasn't as good a waves maybe as Pleasure Point, but it was, well, here we are. We're in Capitola. We live here. It's easy to get here. And they used to surf down by the sewer house. There were some waves there.
Tell us a little bit about the bowling alley that used to be in Capitola.
I spent hours in that bowling alley. Not bowling. I did a little bit of bowling, but was not really very good at it. My first game was the best I ever did. But my boyfriend, Rich Gunther, was a pin setter. And in those days, it was manually done. Nowadays, they have all they have all electronic machines that will reach down and pick up the pins and put down a new set and so forth. But it was all done by hand. And I don't know if he had any hearing left after that job. But he would be behind the pins in the very back of the alley.
Must have been pretty noisy.
Oh, yeah. It must have been just deafening. And I don't know that he actually wore any ear protection. But so I would hang out at, there was a little counter and coffee, sort of diner food. They served coffee and hamburgers and milkshakes and that sort of thing. And I would hang out there, sit on the stool at the counter, and that's where I started drinking coffee, because it was cheap and I could linger over it for a long time and wait for Rich to get on his break, and then he and I could spend 15 or 20 minutes together and hang out, and then he would go back to his job and I would finish my coffee.
And this was while you were still in high school?
This was while I was still in high school. Rich and I went steady, I say most of my junior year and my senior year, and he actually bought an engagement ring and a wedding band and gave them to me, and my parents said no, I couldn't wear them until I was 18, because I was only 16 at the time. And there's actually a connection with our relationship at the beginning was at the Capitola bowling alley. The end of our relationship was at the Surf Bowl in Santa Cruz. I told him, I don't know why I waited to tell him until we were in the parking lot of the Surf Bowl, but that's where we were. And I told him that I wanted to break up with him because I'd realized that although he was nice, I was not in love with him. And so I gave him back. Because I couldn't wear the engagement ring, he had given me his high school class ring. And what girls did at that time to make this giant ring fit was you would take dental floss and wrap it around the back of the ring until there was this blob of dental floss big enough so that the ring would fit on your finger, and then you would lacquer the dental floss with nail polish. I have no idea who first came up with that idea, but so I wore his high school ring with this big blob of dental floss and nail polish on the back of it for quite some time. And that was how I, breaking up with him, of course I gave it back to him. And he took it and threw it across the parking lot of the surf bowl. He was upset and angry. And I later heard that he went back the next day and went, my class ring, why did I do that? And tried to find it, never did.
Was he about the same age as you, or a little older?
He was a couple years older. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your involvement with the Capitola area after you graduated from Soquel High. You graduated in '66, correct?
Yeah, I graduated from Soquel High in 1966 and started going to Cabrillo. And in 1968, in the summer of 1968, I moved away from home. I moved into my first apartment in Capitola at 105 Fairview Avenue on the Depot Hill. My apartment was a little one-bedroom place above a garage on Fairview Avenue behind their main house. And it was, you went up the stairs and went in the door. The door brought you directly into this tiny little kitchen. If there were two people in that kitchen, it was one person too many. You could stand at the sink and turn around and you were at the stove. It was a very narrow little pathway through the kitchen into the living room, and then through the living room into the one bedroom. And so the only way in and out of the apartment was through the kitchen. And as soon as we moved in, I was pregnant at the time. And we had a baby shower. My sister and my best friend organized it, and it was fairly unique at the time that it was a co-ed baby shower, and there were no traditional baby shower games. It was just a party with my friends, and a nice cake that my sister got that said, "Welcome, baby," something like that. But we had a great party. But before that, the first thing that we did when I moved in was my older sister said, "Let's have a dinner, and you can invite Chet, who's the guy I was dating at the time, and I'll invite Gary." I think Gary was the guy she was interested in, and we'll cook a dinner. This is great. We have our own place. You got your own place. We'll be able to do a dinner. And we borrowed a tablecloth and sufficient plates and stuff from our parents. And so we decided on a relatively easy menu: a roast beef, baked potatoes, corn on the cob, and a salad. So we put the roast and the potatoes in the oven. We turned the oven on, and then we got the salad ready and everything, and then we went in the other room, and we were laughing and having a good time, and probably drinking a little wine, and had other friends that were coming over to see, here's the new apartment, this is great. In fact, I just remembered this. Frank Urbanczyk, when he came over, the first time that he came over to the apartment, he looked at, there were the couches. There were two couches that were avocado green, yes, of course, because it was the 70s, and Naugahyde. And he sat down on the sofa and flung himself back on the back bolsters and realized that, actually, the bolsters on the sofa looked like they were pillows, but in fact it was a wood frame with Naugahyde over it. So he really cracked his back on it. So dinner. So the roast is in the oven, and we're sitting on the avocado Naugahyde sofas in the living room, showing other friends the apartment and such. And all of a sudden we realize that there's smoke coming out of the oven. So we go in the kitchen and open the oven and realize that there's flames coming from the stove. We grab the roast and throw it in the sink and the potatoes were in the same pan. They're in the sink, and there's smoke everywhere. And our friend Dave realizes that the smoke is coming from the broiler pan. So he pulls the broiler pan out, and there's flames shooting up from the broiler pan. He throws that in the sink. And being, 19, 20 years old and dumb, we turned the water on, which of course made the grease fire splatter everywhere. The kitchen curtains melted, and there was a big black smoke smudge on the ceiling. But we did finally get the fire out, and the roast was, what we realized later is that the people who had lived in the apartment before had not mentioned to us or to the landlord that the thermostat on the oven was broken. So when you turned the oven or the broiler, when you turned the oven on, it just kept getting hotter. It didn't kick off when it reached whatever temperature you'd set it at. They had known that, and so they had mostly used the broiler, but they hadn't ever cleaned it, and so the broiler was full of grease. And as the oven got hotter and hotter and hotter, it finally just set that grease on fire. The roast was burnt on the outside, raw in the middle. The potatoes were burnt on the outside, raw in the middle. So our dinner was basically corn on the cob and salad, and it was an adventure, but it was not exactly the most successful first meal. And after that, my dad suggested that maybe I would want to have a rope ladder going out of the bedroom window down to the backyard. And I just said, "Oh, Daddy, oh, for heaven's sakes." But he was looking with the wiser sense of an adult and going, the only way in and out of this place is through this kitchen. And yeah, if there's a fire in the kitchen, there's no way out. But that was the only time that there was a fire.
Tell us about some of your first jobs.
I learned from a friend of mine how to weave beads into a little flower pattern. And I started making bottomless sandals. They were basically decorative beaded flower. There was a loop that fit over one of your toes, and then it looped back around your heel, so you could have decorated feet if you were walking around barefoot. And I wound up making them for this little dress shop called Froto's Hole that was near the corner of Capitola Avenue and Monterey. And so they were carrying my beaded sandals and selling a few, not that many really. They were cute, but not a hot seller. But the woman at Froto's Hole suggested that she would give me a job selling, working the counter, working the cash register, and so forth. And so I did. I worked there for, I forget, it was a week or two, not very long. So I got my first paycheck, and I took my paycheck to the bank and deposited in my bank account, and it bounced. So I took it back to Froto's Hole and said, "Hey, what gives? The paycheck bounced." She told me, "Oh, there was a problem with the bank. Go and deposit it again." And so I did, and it bounced again. So I went back and said, "What's going on here? You need to pay me." And she said, "Well, I can write you another check, or I can give it to you in merchandise." And so I did. I said, "Well, yeah, give me that dress then." And it was clear that it was too small of a dress shop to support her and another person, probably too small really to support her even. And so I didn't work there after that, but I wound up with a cute dress that in retrospect was really short, but it was, you know, the style of the time. It was about this color blue with mushrooms embroidered on the front of it, and then a lace band around the bottom. And I had that dress for a long time.
Tell us a little bit about Linda Prock.
Linda Prock was sort of like the class photographer for the young people in Capitola at that time. She was from the East Coast, and at the time that I met her, she seemed to be part of a nuclear family. So much so that at one point my mom approached her and asked her if she could help put me, the wayward daughter, on some kind of a better pathway. I assumed, as did my parents, that she and Bill and Lisa and Gary were a nuclear family. She and Bill were husband and wife. The children were theirs. And that was not the case at all. It turned out that I found out many years later that actually Linda was escaping from an East Coast abusive marriage. Bill was her widowed brother-in-law, and the children were his. At least I think that's the case. She told me different stories about her past, and that's the one that she told the most consistently, and I think is the true one. But they were not at all the nuclear family that I had expected or understood that they were. Linda lived on Lawn Way and had two apartments, a downstairs apartment where she and Bill, who had the same last name, and two children, Lisa and Gary, who also seemed to have the same last name. They all lived in the downstairs apartment. The upstairs apartment was a dark room and a studio and a place to store all of the costumes that Linda had. And what she would do is sometimes she would take pictures, like she took pictures on the beach and so forth, of the local characters. But a lot of times what she did was we would go either to her apartment, the upstairs apartment, or on an excursion. Sometimes we went up to Davenport. One time we went into Nicene Marks with costumes. We would drag along we would get a bunch of her costumes together, and she really showed me aspects of myself that I had never seen before. You know, it was a wonderful experience. She would get reels of movie film and cut them up and use them, you know, and then roll them onto still camera reels so that she would have a lot of film for a relatively inexpensive price. And she and Bill had a darkroom upstairs too, so she did all her own darkroom work and worked in black and white. And she took hundreds and hundreds of photographs of me in different costumes and different locations, and then developed them. And of course she kept the negatives, and she gave me and the other people she was photographing copies of the photographs. And so I have lots and lots of photographs from that era. And she was, the bikers in Capitola adored her. Everybody adored her because she was older than we were, but she was interesting and eccentric and talented too. She was an artist. And the bikers would bring her things. They knew that one of the places that we photographed was Harvey West, the old Evergreen Cemetery. And so they knew she liked tombstones. And at one point, they brought her a tombstone from, I have no idea where. And she said, well, thank you. That's a nice gift, but you got to take it back to where you found it. And she really, like I say, she was a good friend and a fascinating person.
Do you remember some of the other artists in Capitola at that time?
One of the other artists that I became very good friends with, and in fact was friends with up until he passed away a couple of years ago, was Don Herman, who we all knew by his artist name Proviso. And he had an art studio upstairs. It's actually where Mr. Toots is now in Capitola. He had an art studio in there and did fine art paintings, and he never got his due. He did really excellent work, and later wound up doing portraits at the flea market, and local people knew him, but I think he just didn't have the marketing skills or connections to give him the artistic recognition that he should have gotten. And I do have, in his later years, he lived on the East Coast, and every once in a while an envelope would show up from him, and he would send me a drawing of his, either a reproduction of one of his pieces of work, or sometimes he would send me a birthday card or something like that that was an original drawing by him, telling me to have a happy, hippie, hoppy birthday.
Did you know artist Olaf Palm?
I knew of him. I knew of him, and I knew his work, but I didn't really know him personally. He was a little older than the crowd that I hung out with. One of the places where my friends and I spent a lot of time was at the Local, which was owned by Tom Luagi, who later owned Club Zianti up in the San Lorenzo Valley. The Local, I started spending time in the Local when I was actually not 21, but no one ever asked me for my ID. And I was dating two of the bartenders anyway. And I don't remember if I started dating them. I think I met them in the Local. And at one point, one of my friends said to me, you keep complaining that you get a boyfriend and then all he wants to do is hang out in the Local. Well, if you meet him there, that's probably a good indication of that's where he likes to spend his time. But as I said, I was dating two of the bartenders, Tuffy and Eric, and they decided at one point that they wanted me to choose between the two of them. And so I get a knock on my front door, and I open the door, and they're both there. So they came in, and they sat down, and I sat down, and we smiled at each other, and I offered them a beer or a glass of wine, something like that, and we sat around and talked, and it was awkward, and I really didn't know what to do. I liked them both. They were, but I wasn't prepared to choose and send one of them home, so I really did not know what to do. There was a knock on the door, and I opened it, and it was my favorite boyfriend. And so Mike came in, and I went in the other room and got his jacket that I had borrowed from him, and invited him in and sent Tuffy and Eric on their way. And so they were probably, but I never dated either one of them after that. They were probably both so annoyed at the way that the evening had ended. But I did spend a lot of time in the local, and another one of the people that I met there was Mike, who they called Milk Truck Mike. His last name was Reedy, and one of his other nicknames was Half a Song Reedy. He was a singer and a guitar player, and he was also, as we all were, smoking a lot of pot in those days. And so he would sit down with his guitar and he would start into a song and sing a verse or two, and then he would get distracted and either stop playing guitar or start into some other song. And so that I don't know that he ever actually finished a song, which is, of course, how he got his nickname. The reason he was called Milk Truck Mike is because he had an old milk truck. He had a step van that at one time had been a Borden's milk truck, and you could still see under the paint Lucy the cow on the side, but he had painted yellow paint over it. It was probably the most recognizable vehicle in Capitola at the time. He had friends. He was originally from Chicago, and he had friends. His friends Doug and Brummel came out from Chicago. And they were a little rougher than he was. Brummel was actually a member of the Chicago Outlaws, a Hells Angels equivalent in Chicago. And Doug was a musician. They came out. They were both hunters, and we had a lot of food in those days, but it was all surplus food. There was no fresh produce. There was no fresh meat. We had surplus food overflowing our cupboards, cheese and rice and pinto beans and cornmeal and flour.
Where did you get the surplus?
The surplus food was from it was U.S. Department of Agriculture surplus, and the reason for it was to subsidize the dairy farmers and the the people that were producing the food, and it was distributed through the welfare office. We would go over. The place where they distributed it was kind of over by Dominican Hospital. And you would go, and based on the number of people in your household, they would give you boxes of food. And you never quibbled about what they were giving you because you didn't want to seem ungrateful. Even if you had already 10 5-pound bags of flour at home, because who knew at 19 years old how to cook? None of us did. We actually had a recipe on the kitchen wall for how to make pancakes with surplus flour, surplus powdered milk, surplus powdered eggs, and then we had Caro corn syrup that we would add maple flavoring for the syrup, and surplus butter to go on the pancakes. But so we would take everything they gave us, not wanting to appear uppity or ungrateful. And most of it was edible, but the meat was really marginal. It was all canned meat. There was canned beef, which you could make into stews. It was pretty salty. It was all pretty salty. The canned chicken you could make a cream sauce or something and put it over noodles, and it wasn't too bad. There was a sort of a bologna spam-like thing that was, okay, you could do stuff with it. The pork, even the dogs wouldn't eat it. So the guys from Chicago, the hunters from Chicago, get this idea. We're going to get some fresh meat. Look at all these pigeons on the telephone wires. If we can shoot them, and one of the women knew how to pluck a bird, we can have fresh meat. We'll have the squab. There you go. And so the hunting party consisted of, in Mike's milk truck, Mike would be driving. Doug and Brummel would be, I don't think they had a rifle, but they each had pistols. They were the shooters, and then whatever young woman they could round up was the fetch dog to go and get these dead birds and bring them back to the step van. I have no idea why nobody ever called the police. This was, like I say, it was a pretty recognizable vehicle driving around the Depot Hill in the middle of the day with people shooting at pigeons off the telephone wires, and then some hippie girl in a long flowing dress jumping out of the step van and going and picking the dead bird up and bringing it back and putting it in the truck. I went once. One dead bird was enough for me, and it was like, yeah, you guys are on your own with this hunting expedition. Back to the bowling alley. At that time in the history of the bowling alley, now that I was old enough to be interested, I had friends who were 21, and in addition to the local, they would go, and the local had beer and wine, but the bar that was attached to the bowling alley had a full liquor license, and it was called the Poison Springs. It was owned by a man of Greek heritage called Spiro Banias, and we had one friend in particular who spent a lot of time in there, and there was one night when he had had sufficient to drink that Spiro threw him out. And so he kind of wandered around Capitola for a while, being annoyed at the fact that he'd gotten thrown out of the bar, and realized at some point that he'd forgotten his hat. So he decided, well, I better go back and get my hat. He had a big white cowboy hat that he wore all the time. So he goes back, and he realized two things. One, it was after 2 o'clock in the morning, so the bar was officially closed. Two, whoever had been responsible for closing the bar at the end of the evening had neglected to lock the door. So he goes in and he puts his cowboy hat on, and he goes back outside, and then he goes, well, wait a minute. This is interesting. The bar's closed but yet open. And so he recruited another friend who had a pickup truck. And when Spiro came in the morning to open the Poison Springs, it was dry as a bone. There was not a drop of alcohol. They even took the open bottles that had the corks in them and stuff behind the bar that were partly empty, and nobody ever got caught for it. They never figured out who did it, but a lot of us had enough alcohol to last us for quite some time. I remember I had a couple of the bar bottles for quite some time.
Did you go to the Capitola Theater very often?
I did indeed. The Capitola Theater was a great place to go. It was inexpensive. They always had a double bill so you could see two movies. And the most importantly for me at that time is they had a crying room. If you had a small child and you wanted to go and see a movie without disturbing the rest of the patrons, you could go to the Capitola Theater and up a little stairway in the back of the theater and into a room that was soundproofed so that any noise that was happening inside that room wouldn't disturb the rest of the theater patrons. But they piped the sound in, and there was a big glass window looking out so you could make as much noise as you wanted but still be able to see and hear the movies that were being shown. My daughter was an infant and toddler at that time, and she was very social, very chatty. And if she was in the theater, she would be the one who would be standing up on the chair, looking over the seat and talking to the person behind her. So we would always go to the Capitola Theater, go in the crying room. They had a big sofa. They had a little bassinet if you had an infant or if she, by some miracle, wanted to go to sleep. And a couple of overstuffed chairs. So it was actually a pretty comfortable place to go and watch a movie, even if you didn't have a little kid with you, but we did spend a lot of time in there.
Tell us about the copper wire caper.
Ah, yes. One of the regulars in Capitola was a fellow they called Carney, and he was always short of money. He drank a lot of wine. He always needed money to get wine, and the idea of actually holding down a full-time job was not one that he looked on favorably. But he always had some kind of a scheme for how he was going to get some money. And so he and a couple of his buddies decided at one point, they noticed that if you go along the railroad tracks that go through Capitola and past New Brighton and on down towards Watsonville, at the time there were still telegraph wires running along next to the railroad line. They were no longer being used, but they were these long stretches of copper wire that were just there waiting for someone to get the idea to take them down, roll them up, and take them down to the scrapyard and sell them. Copper fetched a pretty good price in those days. So Carney and his friend decided that they were going to do that. And while they were underway, while they were pulling it was a lot of work. It took them quite a big chunk of the day to do it, because you had to climb up the telephone poles and disconnect them and then roll the wire up and then drag it over to the back of their pickup truck and put it in the truck. Well, in the process of them doing that, somebody noticed and called the appropriate authorities, called the police, called the railroad, I don't know, but the police just waited until, I guess, had talked to the railroad, and so they just waited until Carney and his friend were all done. The pickup truck was full to the gills of copper wire, and then the police swooped in and said, "Southern Pacific thanks you very much for helping them take their copper wire down. We will be confiscating it now." So they didn't get any wine that day, and they didn't get arrested. They just they figured that the disappointment of having worked all day long in the hot sun and not winding up with nothing for all that work was punishment enough.
I understand you have a story on how the Monterey Avenue pathway came to have a railing along it.
Jason Fuller. Jason was, he had been in the Merchant Marine, and when he got out of the Merchant Marine, he made his way to Capitola, and he was another one who drank a fair bit. And he and I dated for a while, and he lived in the Capitola Flats, and he would come up. There was a pathway. There's a raised pathway that goes along the side of Monterey Avenue, and a pathway that goes from that raised walkway up to Depot Hill, to the corner of Fairview Avenue and Grand Avenue, right where my house was. So when he wanted to come and visit me, he would come up that pathway and visit, and then go back down to his house down in the Capitola Village. And there was one evening that he had had a bit too much to drink when he was up on the Depot Hill, and I honestly don't remember if he was visiting me or he had other friends that also lived up on the Depot Hill. But as he was making his way down the hill, at the time there was no railing along the Monterey Avenue raised walkway, and he fell off of that walkway, broke his jaw, and shortly thereafter the city of Capitola put in the metal railing that you can see now along that raised walkway, and I'm sure that his accident had a lot to do with their realization that maybe that wasn't the safest pathway to get down into the Capitola Village. Jason is also the person who goes with another story. Jason met a woman named Jan, and they decided to get married. She wanted a formal wedding with him in a tuxedo and her in a white gown, which had to be altered because she was pregnant at the time they got married. They decided to, as a compromise, she did indeed wear a white full wedding gown with the veil and everything, and he wore a tuxedo. However, they decided to have the wedding at New Brighton Beach, and they both were barefoot, and they invited all their wild hippie friends. Somebody brought down a keg of wine, somebody else brought their puppies. There were the guys from Chicago with their big hunting knives stuck in their belts, and there was Half a Song Reedy with his guitar. Somebody brought a goat, and so there were all these people, this wedding going on, and the park ranger shows up, and he looked at the scene, and he didn't know where to start, and he just kind of stood there dumbfounded. Someone roped him into getting his picture taken with the bride and the groom. So there's a picture of this very bemused looking park ranger with Jason and Jan, and Linda Prock took the photographs of the wedding. So there's pictures of the park ranger looking like deer in the headlights, and he, like I say, he didn't know where to start. It's like, you're not supposed to have alcohol on the beach. You're not supposed to have puppies running around. You're not supposed to have people with weapons on the beach. And Nobody asked the park if it was okay to have a wedding on the beach, for that matter. And he finally just decided to call it a day, and he said, the goat. You can't have the goat. The goat has got to go. And he scooted away, left the scene, and figured he had done his regulatory job as best he could, and let the rest of the wedding go on. As I had mentioned before, all of us were stone broke and had lots and lots of surplus food, not a lot else. We decided that we didn't want to throw rice at the wedding, because we all knew how to cook rice, and that was food. We weren't going to throw that. But we all had bags and bags and bags of flour, because our ability to cook was somewhat short of being able to do stuff with the mountains of flour that we got from surplus food. So we decided to, instead of throwing rice, we would throw flour. And the wedding, after the vows were spoken, devolved into a crazy flour fight that I'm sure left a layer of white flour on the beach, and layers on all of the participants in the wedding, and then people dove into the ocean to get the flour off of them, and Linda took pictures of that too. So
you used the term Capitola Flats, which I think is what now we call Capitola Village. Mm-hmm. Do you remember when that name got changed?
I don't really, but it was more, it was kind of both. It was called both, but Capitola Village to me encompasses not just the area that is down along the Esplanade and Capitola Avenue, but Capitola Village extends kind of partway up the hill.
On Capitola Avenue?
On Capitola Avenue, on Monterey Avenue. So to me, Capitola Village is a larger area. The Capitola Flats was more, this is the part of Capitola that is flat, that is down in the flat area along Capitola Avenue, San Jose Avenue, and the Esplanade.
I see. I like to ask everybody a little bit about the Loma Prieta earthquake. Do you have some memories from the earthquake?
Well, I would say the most Capitola-related memory of the earthquake is, again, it comes back to my friend Linda Prock. Linda, at the time of the earthquake, was living in the St. George Hotel in downtown Santa Cruz, and working there too. She was the night desk, and I'll tell you, she had a lot of interesting stories about the people who lived in the St. George, and her experiences there. When the earthquake hit, she lost her home and her job, and actually had 15 minutes to go in escorted and get out whatever she could get out of her things. She basically lost all of her negatives, and that was a huge disappointment. She, of course, got her cameras and some of her clothes, but so she had no place to live. And where she wanted to go from there was back to Capitola. And so I loaned her the money to get into, she found an apartment that was on Monterey Avenue, right at the top of Monterey Avenue, right close to the railroad tracks. And gave her, I wound up loaning her not only the money to pay the first and last and deposit to get into the place, but also loaned her, you know, she had nothing. She needed sheets and silverware and tablecloths and dishes and pots and pans, and so I loaned her a lot of things. And she and Lisa and Gary lived in that apartment until the end of her life.
Well, the late 60s, early 70s is well known as the hippie era. Did you and your friends in Capitola consider yourself to be hippies?
Yeah, we did. We did. Not when I first moved to Capitola. When I first moved there, I was just a teenage pregnancy moving away from home. As we evolved and the times changed with us, we definitely considered ourselves hippies. And it was a wonderful era. We none of us had any money. Most of us were not working. My best friend, who was also teen pregnancy, lived across the street from me, also on Fairview Avenue. I had a bunch of friends who lived in a big house. Jason was one of them, lived in a big house down in the Capitola Village, in the Flats. And we had a good time. We had a good time. We smoked a lot of pot. It was pretty low-grade pot compared to the stuff that's out there now. But we always had, I'm not quite sure how, since we were all stony broke, I'm not quite sure how we had pot, but we always did. We always seemed to have enough money to party. And actually, what the folks, Jason and the people who lived in the house down in the Flats, when things got particularly tight, they would throw a potluck party, and they would take things like the bags of potato chips and stuff, and whatever food they could, they would tuck away, put it in a drawer or behind the sofa, so that they would have food to last them to the end of the month. And then the first of the month, we would all go down to the surplus food. At least we always had food, because we could certainly, pretty much anyone who was not working, had no visible income, could get the surplus food. And yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your career and later life.
Most of my career, I started in the early 70s working for a nonprofit food co-op, and that evolved into a career in nonprofit accounting. I worked for about 25 years, really, in Santa Cruz, most of it at the, there was a community action board program that I worked for, and then I worked for Food and Nutrition Services, which is now Community Bridges. And then I worked for a nonprofit that started in Santa Cruz that partnered with Apple Computers to help human service nonprofits get computers and get training about how to use computers to further their mission. And the last 16 years of my work life, I worked as a financial manager in the social sciences division at UC Santa Cruz. And so I've pushed numbers around for most of my working career. I didn't always sell dresses in tiny little tiny little dress shops in Capitola.
Well, thank you, Nancy, for being part of the Capitola Memories Project.
It's been a pleasure.
Capitola, come to the coast with me. The sun and the sky are free. We'll play in the sand and sea. Capitola, paradise you'll adore. I'll take your hand there on the sand along the shore. Capitola, over the bridge we'll go. We'll capture the sunset glow and wait for the creek to flow. Capitola, sway to the ocean's roar. Beside the strand we'll hear the band down by the shore. Capitola.